busy show today. Will a second Donald Trump term in the White House be good for Britain? Plus, one man's devastating story of life on the streets. You've never heard anything like it. But we start with my hot take. Honest question, do this government have a death wish? Are they determined to bankrupt the country? Is this some kind of scorched earth policy? Do they not realise that to deliver their agenda, vast investment in public services, everyone getting a pay rise and the building of 1.5 million new homes, that they'll need some money to do that? But then these radical lefties don't understand money, do they? The academic and political thinker Friedrich Hayek said that if socialists understood economics, they wouldn't be socialists at all. And so it's proved, with an economy just months ago at the top of the G7, beating even America, and now in effective recession. Rachel Reeves' budget for growth turned out to be a budget for debt and decline. And in what looks to be a perfect economic storm, enter stage left Deputy PM Angela Rayner, council house entrepreneur, and a woman with more previous addresses than a fairground worker. Rayner, who is also Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government, may God help us, has launched a vicious assault on Britain's businesses, who, don't forget, do us all a favour by actually employing people and paying them a living. Rayner has launched a raft of red tape measures so damaging they make Rachel Reeves' Soviet October budget look positively Thatcherite by comparison. Rayner, who I've got to say I wish stuck to doing Sharon Stone impersonations, has adopted a French-style workers' rights package, which will presumably achieve the same thing that's happened in France: sky-high unemployment and businesses collapsing under the weight of their own bureaucracy. Now, yes, France has better workers' rights than the UK, but it's also harder to get a job and keep one, and unemployment is through the roof. Sounds like a hollow victory to me. But when it comes to making life harder for companies, Angela Rayner has looked at France and said, hold my beer. Under these ridiculous new rules, it's going to be much harder to fire someone if they're rubbish at their job. Which means welcome to the world of costly tribunals and unfair dismissal claims. So you know what's going to happen. Employers won't bother. Why should they take a chance on a new team member who may sue and therefore cost a fortune and create a legal nightmare? It's not going to happen. They won't bother. I preferred it when things were free and open. If you got a job, you had to demonstrate that you were up to it and that you could deliver for the company. It's called merit, justifying your existence, adding value. Forgive me for indulging in such controversial ideas. Any business fearful of hiring a dud that they can't get rid of will simply make do with their current resources and hand more responsibility to the existing team, who are employed under the normal circumstances, in the good old days when you had to know what you were doing, and if you didn't, you were out. Now, there's another thing which is an absolute shocker. There's going to be sick pay from day one and compassionate leave. So it means that you can hire someone and within days be bankrolling the lengthy bereavement of their dear Uncle Bob, or Fido the dog. Or you could be paying them to stay at home with stress or mental health issues or some mysterious back complaint that was never mentioned in the interview. Now, I've got to say that most people are decent and honest. But these so-called workers' rights laws will be leveraged and exploited by bad actors. Wrong-uns who will happily game the system to squeeze money out of already cash-strapped employers. And hey, I speak as someone who has been fired recently, quite publicly. It wasn't my choice, it's my view that I was delivering. But that's their call. Fair enough, shit happens. Dems the brakes, it is okay. It's my job to roll up my sleeves and get on with it. And I'm delighted to say that thanks to you, it's already proving very successful. And I don't work for a company anymore. You're the boss now, and I'm here to deliver for you just how I like it. Now, in case you think that I'm scaremongering about these new laws, the Telegraph newspaper report that the boss of Thorley Tavern, an excellent pub group in the southeast, has said that first day employment rights will simply mean that they hire less people. The boss, Philip Thorley, who's a top man, said, "What incentive is there to hire more people and young people? As an employer," he says, "I appreciate that whenever I interview someone, they're interviewing me as well. In the first few weeks, we decide if we like them, if they like us. But now it's one-sided." He's absolutely right. The publican, whose family outfit has been going for 50 years but may not manage another 50, has also said that Labour's tax rises mean that his staff costs will go up by almost £500,000 a year. Now, this is a small pub group. These awful policies will hurt them. And it means that youngsters in the area won't get a job pulling pints as a result. To make matters worse, 0 hours contracts have been axed. Now, this government appears to hate choice because it's getting rid of a freedom enjoyed last year by over 1 million people. Single parents, retired people, students who previously could choose when and where to work with no commitment now don't have that opportunity. Lord Wolfson, the chief executive of fashion giant Next, said, "We offer staff extra hours in the run-up to Christmas. Under this new law and with the axing of 0 hours contracts, that will be impossible." So, less work for ordinary people, and yet Labour are the party of ordinary working folk. Make it make sense. Meanwhile, Angela Rayner'S going to hand further power to the trade unions to go on strike, which, by the way, don't forget, even under the Conservatives, the train drivers and the junior doctors were holding the country to ransom. Well, now we've given all of the unions across a whole range of sectors power to absolutely cripple Britain and then some. And then there's the madness of protecting the mental well-being of workers, meaning that if they hear something unpleasant in the workplace, they can sue. It means that if a customer in the pub makes an off-colour joke or says that a bloke in a dress isn't a woman, and a bar staff member hears it and is upset, months of legal action could ensue. Some pubs are thinking of introducing banter bouncers to listen to what customers are saying and chucking people out for thinking or saying the wrong thing or making remarks that stray from the woke government narrative. Let's be honest, saying "stop the boats" will probably ensure that you never darken the corridors of a pub ever again. Now, the scale of these changes is huge and horrific. It's thought that an extra 9 million staff could have the right to take companies to court for grievances such as unfair dismissal under this new regime. Currently, people must be employed for at least 2 years before they can sue, by which time, hopefully, you've weeded out the losers and the wastrels. Now, unfair dismissal claims are often without merit. They're usually without merit, but that doesn't matter because businesses will still be forced to spend months of time and resources defending these claims, even if there is no case to answer, which makes it likely that companies will settle out of court in order to make the whole problem go away. And that means payouts of thousands for unjustified claims, money that they just don't have. Now, a Whitehall insider told The Telegraph businesses are angry because they don't want to get sued, and they're mystified that the government seems blasé about employment consequences. It comes across, this insider says, as incompetent. Tell me about it. But Rayner'S assault on business won't only hurt companies, it will hurt the economy. Because with recruitment and investment down, unemployment will rise, which means that people that might have had a job pulling pints at their local will now be reliant on benefits to survive. Plus, these companies with lower profits, more costs and more debt will be paying smaller tax receipts. And of course, those tax receipts generate the national income that surely we all want, including Rachel Reeves and her apparent obsession with growth. Now, the only thing that's growing is anger about this wicked, incompetent, cruel and stupid government. The truth is that we don't need to focus all of our anger and incredulity on Rachel Reeves. No. They are all clowns. Please stop this circus ride. I want to get off. Now, before we carry on, to watch the whole show ad-free, head to The Mark Dolan Show on the Substack app or go to markdolan.com. Now, as he enters the White House for a second time, will Donald Trump be good for Britain and the world? Let's get the views of fearless political commentator and former Conservative parliamentary candidate Kane Blackwell. Hi, Kane.
Hi, Mark. How are you?
I'm very well. No ambiguity from you. Anyone watching will see that you're wearing a MAGA hat, so you're all in when it comes to Trump.
I am. I mean, back in 2016, I was a little bit wary, I think. A lot of people were, particularly a lot of sort of what I would say British Conservatives.
Yeah.
We're not exactly the same as Republicans. That I think America in general is just more further to the right than Britain is. That is slightly changing, hopefully now, which I do think is a good thing. But yeah, I do think, since 2016, Trump just proved himself as a real conservative who actually wanted to get stuff done, but not just as a conservative, but as someone who actually believes in freedom, who wanted to change the way we do things, not just in America, but in the West in general.
Is it the duty of all British Conservatives to support Donald Trump over the next 4 years? Is it important that the right in this country get behind the MAGA project?
I think it's really important that we all support President Trump, because at the end of the day, a strong America will mean a strong Britain. Particularly in terms of global security. And I do think it is important on Conservatives to actually learn from what President Trump has been able to achieve.
Yeah.
He always says, we've never seen anything like it, but it's true, we haven't. We don't see, political movements like the Make America Great Again movement really ever in British history. I mean, apart from Vote Leave in 2016, that's really the only sort of comparison where you can talk about, that movement that has transcended, usual political sort of ideals of, left and right. People have come together and actually said, particularly in this last election in 2024 for Trump, people from all wings of the political spectrum have actually come together as a grand coalition to support him. So I do think it's imperative on Conservatives particularly to stand up for what Donald Trump is doing. Obviously we need to call him out when we might disagree on certain issues, but like anyone. But at the end of the day, this is actually what conservatism is meant to be about. Actually, reducing the size of the state and draining the swamp.
Well, indeed, although there is a difference, isn't there, as you've intimated, between Trumpism and conservatism. Is that a problem, and could that produce cracks further down the line within the political right?
I don't think it's a problem. I think it's a challenge that sort of traditional conservatives, or neocons as some like to call them, need to actually start to really look at. And I think the one sort of big difference is sort of the tariff situation. For a lot of Conservatives. That word is a scary word, and rightly so, to be honest. We believe in free trade. But at the end of the day, when free trade is not working for your country and it is actually damaging, in certain aspects, and the problem is what Trump is talking about isn't free trade when we say, a mutual agreement between nations. We're talking about, particularly America, being done over by, other countries just because it's cheaper to manufacture in places like China or Mexico. And it's totally wrong. This is it's the same in our country. Manufacturing is so expensive to do in the UK, but that's why we need to deregulate, and that's what Trump's talking about. Get rid of these environmental regulations, get rid of these other protections that really hinder businesses from actually being able to grow, and that's the key thing. And I think really, if Conservatives don't understand that and don't appreciate that the world has moved on from the 1980s, it's not the same as what it once was. The world is different. We actually need to move with the times, and conservatism has never always been a transient thing. It has always adapted. Margaret Thatcher brought in, Thatcherism, which for many, many Conservatives now is mainstream conservatism.
Yeah.
But back then, that was a radical idea. So, Trumpism, MAGA, whatever you want to call it, is just a new vein, a new brand of conservatism, and it's something that will need to be looked at.
And Donald Trump is very much a flag bearer for the conservative movement globally. So is it a worry on your part that if the presidency doesn't work out, if inflation goes up, let's say the economy goes into recession, if there are other problems, that this could damage the whole movement?
I just don't think that will happen. I honestly just don't think it will. I think he knows what he's doing. I think he's got some really excellent people around him. And I also think the policies that he's enacting generate growth and actually don't allow those things to happen sort of as a sort of on a mass scale of what we have seen and what we are seeing. So I don't think Trump has that problem. I don't think we will see that problem. But I can understand that if things don't go right or things don't go well, or if people don't feel like there is change, then obviously there is going to be a bit of backlash to that. But I just don't see that happening. I actually do fundamentally believe that he's going to enact sweeping change, massive reform of the country and of the state in Washington, that, these things are going to not even be a consideration.
Indeed. Now, we've obviously got this Labour government for the next 4 years, Kane. If Trump is, I know, God forbid, if Trump is successful, do you think Sir Keir Starmer might acknowledge that success? And could Labour shift to the right whilst in government in order to accommodate this Trump wave?
No, I don't think Starmer has got it in him to move to the right. I mean, he in his leadership contest back in, must have been 2019 now. Yeah. He was very good at moving to the left because that's naturally where he is. He's always been on the Jeremy Corbyn side of the Labour Party. I mean, why was it for so many years that he remained in Jeremy Corbyn's cabinet? Because he feels at home with these people. This is where his ground is. So I don't think he's going to move any sort of drastic way. Maybe he will start negotiations on a trade deal, and I really, really hope he does, and I really hope the Labour government do this, because if they don't, we are going to really, really damage our relationship with the United States and actually not take an opportunity that is right in front of us. I think Donald Trump and I think the Americans do want a free trade deal with us. It's just got to be one that works for both sides. And unless we get to the negotiating table, which the previous Conservative government, it was when Trump was last in, was ready to sort of get that going. Obviously, then you had the 2020 election, and then that changed things. So there is a starting point already, and people like Nigel Farage and others have talked about a sector by sector deal, where it's not sort of a sweeping broad brush, but actually looking at it, what sectors matter to us. Because, for example, farming is a contentious issue. So we might not want a free trade deal around farming, for example, or agriculture. So that's one aspect of it. But I do think that Keir Starmer will have to, if he wants to actually achieve something, will actually need to work with Donald Trump on this. Because if not, and this is what I fear, is they're going to move back towards the European way of doing things, which will be absolutely disastrous for our country. I mean, the Eurozone is a failing economy. They are going down the tank, and we don't want to be a part of that. That's why we voted to leave. That's why we voted for Brexit. So, it's actually time for him to step up to the plate and take the opportunity that is right in front of him.
Can Labour be trusted to broker a satisfactory trade deal with America, though?
I mean, I wouldn't trust them to do it because I just don't believe that they're good negotiators. These people, I mean, no one on that front bench of the Labour team has ever even been, run a business, has ever really worked in a business. So to expect them to be able to negotiate with a man who has one of the greatest business empires in the world is laughable. I just do not believe that they are going to be able to do that. I hope they do. I hope they prove me wrong, and I hope they prove many others wrong. But I just doubt they will.
Now, Kane, Europe and the West are noticeably shifting right. Why have Britain just elected a left-wing Labour government?
Britain has elected a left-wing Labour government not because they wanted to, but because it was the only other option than the Conservative Party. And I say that with a lot of sadness. I stood in the last general election as a Conservative.
You ran a great
And
campaign. You made headlines.
thank you, Mark. And it was a really damaging time for us. But we have ourselves to blame. We cannot keep saying that it's this person's fault or it's that reason. We were there, we made the decisions, and we have to take responsibility for that. Now, last week, Kemi Badenoch, I believe, started to do that with her speech, which is really important, and it's a great step forward. I think we need to go further. I actually think we need to be talking about reform of the party, a lot more democratising the party. It's what Keir Starmer did, sort of the opposite way around, though, where he sort of took control of the party, got rid of all the Corbynites and sort of made it in his vision. But the Conservative Party actually needs to open up, become a more democratic party, and actually show that it's different from Reform, for example, which, it is Nigel Farage's party. There isn't a huge amount of democracy within that party at the moment. I understand it's a new party, so there's always going to be sort of bit of discrepancies. But I do think that the Conservative Party has a chance to change now. Now, going back to the original question, why did we vote for one? I don't think people voted because they wanted this government. They just wanted change. They didn't want socialism. They just wanted a difference. They wanted something different. And I think we, as the Conservative Party, didn't offer them change, didn't offer them anything new. And actually, people were sort of a little bit sick and tired of hearing what we had to say because we delivered on a lot, but we didn't deliver on those real important things, particularly immigration, that, we promised for years and years and years, even before I joined the party, probably before I was alive. It's madness, but I do think there needs to be a new generation coming forward with the Conservative Party. If it wants to survive, it needs to be talking about the things that matter to younger people, owning your own home, actually living in a country that, you feel safe, secure in, that people don't want to leave, that you can earn money, you can make something of yourself. The American dream, I want to hear about the British dream. That's what we need to be talking about. That's what the Conservative Party should be first and foremost for, the British dream, owning your own home, being able to make your own money, and actually achieving something. And I think that's where we need to be. I don't know if we're there yet, but hopefully by the time the next election is, the Conservative Party will have changed.
Well, that's the hope, isn't it? Because now the elephant in the room is Nigel Farage. Reform UK are seen by many of my viewers and listeners, Kane, as the true Conservatives. They stand for low tax. They're going to scrap net zero. They're going to wage a war on woke. And they're going to stop the boats and end illegal and legal immigration to all intents and purposes. So why haven't you joined Reform UK, given that you yourself are a very robust Conservative?
Well, look, I like a lot of what Nigel and Reform has had to say. I was actually a member of UKIP before I was a member of the Conservative Party. I joined UKIP when I was 14 years old. So that's how long I've been doing politics for.
What a typical teenager you were,
Yeah,
Kane.
just a typical teenager, just as everyone else does. But I agree with a lot of what Reform say, and I actually do think this is where the Conservative Party should be. We can't just rip off what Nigel Farage is saying. We actually have to be different and, do actually be genuine about what we believe in, because there is, a school of thought within the Conservative Party. There's lots of different opinions, but we do need to be united on these key fundamental issues like net zero, like, the economy, like immigration. What are we going to do? And the problem that Reform have, I personally think, and I think a lot of Conservatives feel this way, and why, you haven't seen a mass exodus of the Conservative Party to Reform at this moment in time, is because we're not hearing how they're going to do this. They're really good at diagnosing the problem, and I completely agree, and it's important to diagnose the problem, because if you don't know what the problem is, how can you have the answer? But there needs to be a bit more substance. I still don't know what they're going to do on immigration, what they're going to do on things like education, for example, what they're going to do on tax. What are the key fundamentals that Reform want to do? So I think that's their issue is actually getting across their sort of agenda and how they would implement it. But I think the Conservative Party also has that challenge as well, and it will be a battle of ideas. It will be a battle of who the public trusts more. And at the end of the day, at this moment in time, the Conservative Party is not trusted by the public, and they have to earn that back if they ever want a chance of regaining power again.
Do you rate Kemi Badenoch to transform the fortunes of the party?
I actually really do like Kemi. I think she is a strong person. She has a lot of ideas. She's actually, I think, the authentic Conservative. I think she was the most authentic out of the final two, personally, because she has been, talking about these issues for many, many years. Since she became an MP, she's always been, on the right of the party. Okay, there might be slight differences of opinion on certain things, but actually she has been quite consistent in her opinion. And I do think she actually does want to change the party. How she does that and what that looks like, I still think we're waiting to hear. And that's what I'm waiting to hear from, and I think many Conservatives are. What is it that we want to be? What is it that we want to do for our country and for our party? How are we going to be different than what the last 14 years have been? I think we need a massive rebrand. Cameron did it. I don't see why we can't now. Back then it was an existential crisis. When David Cameron took over the party, we haven't been in power since 1990. Oh, actually, since 1997. Sorry, we haven't been in power since 1997. And if we don't actually realise that this is the existential crisis that we are living in right now for the Conservative Party, then we'll never win again. We'll never take back control of our party if we don't realise that this is the crisis. And Conservatives, I found it at local level and at national level, are complacent. They are complacent in nature, I think. So I do think we need to be better at being more proactive, actually finding out what it is we need to do. I could list a number of different things where we went wrong or whatever it is, but it's not just for me to do that. It's for the whole Conservative Party to actually address these issues. But it's also about the leadership and how Kemi in particular is going to reignite the Conservative values and beliefs that we share, and that many, many, many people in this country share as well.
Most definitely, and I've spoken to far too many Tory MPs and ex-Tory MPs who demonstrate that complacency that you're talking about. They're always banging on about how the Tories are the most successful political party in the history of European democracy. Fine, that was then, this is now. I think many Tories are ignoring Nigel Farage, the threat of Reform UK. It's quite clear that the right are going to have to unite in this country at the next election, aren't they, Kane? So what might that look like in material terms?
I do think it is extremely important because, look at history. The reason why the Conservative Party has been the most successful political party in the Western world is because it had a coalition on the right. It had the broad support of everyone on the right. There was no serious other party. Now you're talking about Reform, but pre-Reform, there was really no serious political party that could take on the Conservative Party to be the new Conservative Party. There wasn't that. On the left, you've always had the Lib Dems, you've had the Green Party,
SDP.
You've had Labour, and they split their vote, and the SNP obviously, and they split that vote between them. So we have always been stronger because we are more united than the left. Now, this is the problem that we've had for many years, is there has been huge squabbling, there has been arguments, there's been, backbiting, there's been, knifing of prime ministers and leaders for many, many years. And that is because there is not a united agreement on what we stand for and our beliefs and our values, we let those slip, and we allow people who I personally think should never have been in our party because they're not Conservatives. I mean, people like Heidi Allen and Anna Soubry, who, you know, were arch Remainers, fine, but then were quite happy to sort of run off to, you know, whatever independent, whatever it was called back then in the Brexit years. You sort of go back in time and sort of think, God, how did we do this? How did we even live through this? But, you know, these were Conservative MPs. These were people who got through the candidates process. You know, they were Lib Dems, for God's sake. You know, this is what we have to realise is if we want to be the Conservative Party, we can't just talk it, we have to walk it. We have to live it every single day. And it's about our values, it's about freedom, it's about democracy, it's about enterprise, and it's about opportunity. These are our core beliefs and values, and we need to enact them into every policy, every decision that we make as a party.
Definitely, and I think if the Conservatives become conservative again, that it makes an arrangement with reform more possible. But just to press you on that question, what might a pre or post-election arrangement look like? I mean, could it be that certain seats are protected, you know, no competition between the two parties, candidates stood down? Or is it a case that the Tories, I don't know, there's a hung parliament perhaps, and they enjoy the support of Reform UK in a confidence and supply arrangement or even a coalition? What do you think?
It's all possible. It's all theoretical.
You wouldn't, as a Conservative supporter, you wouldn't rule out any of the above?
I wouldn't rule it out as a political commentator because, you know, as someone who studies politics and is interested in politics, it's always good to realise that anything can happen. We've seen that over the last few years.
Yes.
But what I would say is I do think it will be inevitable that at some point, I mean, someone's going to win or lose in this fight. It's either going to be the Reform or the Conservative Party. And it's just a matter of who's going to win. Now, there is, you know, you could think of in a, you know, an alternative universe, let's just say, that, you know, at some point there is a merger, you know, between the parties. There could be, who knows? But I do think it's inevitable that at some point, if the right, and I'm talking about, not just talking about the Conservative Party, I'm talking about Reform as well now, you know, if the right want to regain control of this country and actually deliver for the British people, and actually do not want a socialist Labour government to inflict even more damage on this country, then we are going to have to be grown-ups. We're going to have to, you know, pull our pants up and actually say, right, what is it we're going to have to do to get these lot out? Because if we don't, and if the right is split, once again, you will have a Labour government. And people on the doorstep didn't like that, you know, that sort of phrase, you know, if you vote Reform, you'll get Labour. At the last election, it was true. Yeah. If you did vote Reform, you did get Labour. You know, I saw it in where I'm from, back in Kent, in Sittingbourne and Sheppey. You know, we lost that seat, a Conservative seat since 2010, lost that seat by 355 votes. Reform were 1,000 votes off of coming second. So this is, you know what I mean? These are the sorts of conversations, these are the sorts of things that we actually have to look at, is the right, together, more united, is bigger than the left. And we have to remember that actually the majority of people in this country are small c, hard-working Conservatives who believe in our values. And as long as we continue to squabble amongst ourselves and actually do not get on with the job of wanting to govern this country in the best interest of the British people, we will continue to see the socialists run havoc across this country.
Kate, before I let you go, one last question. Back to America and the MAGA hat. Reform UK seem to be closer to the Trump White House than the Conservatives. Is this a problem for Kemi Badenoch?
I actually don't quite agree with that statement because, yes, Nigel is very close to Donald Trump and has been a long-standing supporter. And there's no question about that, and I wouldn't question that he's probably the closest British politician to Donald Trump. That I don't believe there's a question in that. But the Conservative Party and the Republican Party have deep, strong links and have historic links together. You know, this isn't just about Donald Trump. This is also about, hundreds of senators, and representatives of the House who have deep, strong relationships with MPs over here, Conservative MPs over here, and the Conservative Party. We've worked together very, very closely over a number of years.
Thatcher and
So,
Reagan, of course, most memorably.
well, exactly. Thatcher and Reagan, really cemented the special relationship and the bond between our two parties. But it goes much deeper than that. This is we have the same shared values, and the Republican Party, again, is a very broad church. Obviously it does have a huge sort of MAGA contingent now, but there is also sort of more moderate conservatives within the party. But what I would say is, just because Nigel Farage is the loudest about his relationship doesn't mean that that's always the deepest or sort of the most closest relationships. I don't think Reform as a party has sort of the deep ties that the Conservative Party does with the Republican Party. And, obviously Priti Patel is out there representing the Conservative Party at the moment as Shadow Foreign Secretary. And she, has huge experience with working with the previous Trump administration. So back in the 2019, she was working with, the Five Eyes allies, but particularly with America, with Bill Barr, with Mike Pompeo. And so, particularly on security deals and arrangements. So, the idea that the Conservative Party isn't sort of entrenched or linked up with the Trump administration is just not true. The Conservative Party is very much deeply involved with the Republican Party, but I do think there is much more we could do to work together. I would like to, I don't think it's sort of a really sort of dynamic relationship as I'd like to see. I'd love to see more Republicans over here, more British Conservatives over in America, sort of working together about how we can solve the issues and the crises that face the West. I'd like to see more of that. I think it definitely happens, but I'd love to see it on a bigger scale because the Republicans and the Conservatives are deeply entwined, and we should work together on these things.
Kane Blackwell is one of the most provocative political commentators out there. You can follow him on X at Kane_Blackwell. Well worth a follow. Kane, catch up soon.
Thank you, Mark.
So here's a question for you. What is homelessness? We know what it means on the surface, but what is the real world lived experience of someone that is sleeping rough or being bounced from hostel to hostel? Why does homelessness happen? And can this poorly understood social phenomenon ever be eradicated? Clearly, it's a nightmare for many, but is it a lifestyle choice for others? Let's get the views of writer and journalist Sean Walsh, who's written an incredible and moving piece about his time sleeping rough in 2015, and that is at the conservativewoman.co.uk. Sean, welcome to the Mark Dolan Show.
Thank you for having me, Mark. Pleasure.
Oh, it's a real treat to have you on the programme. Now, what were the circumstances, Sean, that led to that first night of you sleeping rough?
Okay, good question. I'll give you a little bit of my background first, just briefly. I'm currently a 57-year-old single parent living in Wiltshire. Way back in a different life, I was an academic, which I left to do other civil service jobs. Always, probably from the age of about 19, 20, had a problem with alcohol. And in 2015, that resulted in me having drunk myself and my then 6-year-old little boy homeless. Something obviously I remain ashamed of. The first night homeless, a social worker had to collect my son from me in a car park in a place called Westbury in Wiltshire, which is near Trowbridge, to be taken to meet with some of my family members at a service station on the M4 so that they could look after him. And as he was being driven away, my first thought was one of relief because it meant I could get back to the pub. That's the situation I was in my life. So that was my first night homeless in Westbury. Yeah, the first night was in Westbury. I managed to find somewhere to sleep that night. And it was very, very cold. So that was the first night. The generic answer to your question, Mark, is I
Mm.
basically, if you like, chose to become homeless and chose to take my son down with me, which is appalling. But, that's the honest answer.
Well, you were suffering an illness, which is alcoholism, which is why you mustn't be judged. And I think many homeless people should not be judged. Can you tell me, Sean, about the physical ordeal of being a rough sleeper, especially at the moment? Because when this goes out, where are we at? It's mid-January. It's 19th, 20th of January,
Yeah.
and London is cold at the moment. So, what is it like trying to sleep in these conditions?
Um, well, you mentioned the cold. That's the obvious one. And then there's hunger. I mean, I was still getting a little bit of money at that point from employment support allowance, so I wasn't absolutely broke. So rather than spend money on a bed and breakfast, which I probably could have done for a couple of nights, I was drinking. So hunger wasn't really kicking in. And gradually, I got to know other people who were sleeping out, as we call it, not just in Westbury, but in Warminster, Trowbridge, Bath, Melksham, all round Wiltshire and Somerset. Um, what was it like physically? It's it's kind of difficult to describe, and one of the reasons it took me so long to write about this, Mark, is that to convey it is so hard, even if you're used to writing stuff. It's like me trying to tell someone who's never had a toothache what a toothache
Yeah.
is like. You can't quite get there, but it's pretty much as you'd expect. Cold, thirsty, hungry, and also the kind of spiritual dislocation that comes with not knowing, certainly to start with, where you're going to be from one night to the next. So you have to get creative. You have to make friendships out there. You have to, it's a certain thing happens where you get to know other people and where they are, and you do get looked after to some extent once you kind of become part of that life. But there's
So
nothing.
there's obviously there's a community element to it among homeless people who look out for each other.
There is, yeah.
Is there also competition for resources among people sleeping rough?
Um, there can be, um, in particular, tobacco and alcohol. I remember in 2015, the Christmas time, in Bath, there was a fight between two people that I knew who were also out on the streets, which resulted in one of them dying. And a lot of us were questioned, a group of us were questioned by detectives in Bath about what exactly had gone on. One of us was arrested, the rest of us were just spoken to, and that was over a piffling amount of tobacco. So yeah, that can happen. Because people are desperate, Mark. I mean, all this stuff is obvious, isn't it? But there are other harms that go along with that. I mean, there are kind of spiritual harms. I would think one of the things I say in the article is that time slows down or time is distorted.
Yeah. Yeah.
Most of us measure out our life in meals. If you don't know where your next meal's coming from, that's difficult. If you don't know where you're going to sleep necessarily, that's difficult because you have to earn a patch, and you have to know where to go. I mean, I was sleeping in Warminster. There's quite an open park where you can sleep, for example, and there are graveyards you can sleep at, but there's safety in numbers, as in all things. So if you can actually get to know some people, that helps. And also, you can get uh, into hostels on the basis of what they call no second night. So you can actually get into hostel just for that night. So you can bounce in and out of hostels, and then you get to know people that way as well. But it's
Clearly,
pretty
there are.
grim. It is grim, yeah. And one of the things I didn't want to
Yeah.
do in the piece was romanticize it, um,
No.
because um, all memory is reconstruction and imagination. And I know that even as I'm recounting it now, I'm sanitizing it as I'm doing it.
Yeah.
So, it's difficult. I'm trying to be authentic, but it's difficult to be 100% accurate about what it's like. Certainly, the distance of nearly 10 years. I mean, it
Well,
started.
your piece is sobering. and it certainly doesn't romanticize what you've been through.
No,
It's clearly a
good.
horrible situation to find yourself in, but the article contains hope as well, and we'll come to that about how
Good.
one might navigate oneself out of a situation like sleeping rough. Can we look at the dangers of sleeping rough? I mean, there are logistical dangers, aren't there? If you're just on the street sleeping outside, you could be attacked, you could be robbed. Did you ever feel unsafe when you were sleeping rough?
Yes. Um, Especially as my background was academia and civil service, so I've never been a fighter, even when
Yeah.
drunk. But yeah, you are vulnerable, um, and just generally vulnerable in that people are quite affronted by the fact of your existence or existing that way. And it's difficult for people to be confronted with someone who's homeless, who's kind of bedraggled and stinks and clearly is outside the normal way of living. So when people are confronted with stuff they don't know how to react to, then with some people, violence is the kind of default reaction, isn't it? And so yeah, I
So
had
is
to. I
that
mean,
is
I was never
yeah.
badly assaulted. And I was careful about where I was when I was actually out on the streets. I mean, my
Well, I mean,
my ordeal
what's
began in November 2015, and I was probably on the streets off and on till middle of 2016, where I found a hostel in Salisbury, which I'd like to talk about specifically, and they kind of brought me back to life and gave me a space as well in which I could get sober um, and get my life together spiritually as well as physically. So I was
so was
lucky.
that
A lot of
hostel
people aren't.
was that hostel in Salisbury, was that the turning point for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I had hostel room in a place in Bath, which I won't name because I'm grateful to them because they probably saved my life by taking me in. But I didn't like the setup, and I don't really want to name it for that reason. But the hostel in Salisbury, which is called Elaborate, it's a Christian charity, which was started 30 years ago now. So yeah, about 30 years ago now, maybe slightly more, by a guy called John Proctor, who was deacon of the Catholic Church in Salisbury. Quite a well-to-do guy, actually, quite successful. But he found a homeless drunk in the street and took him into his home. And having prayed on it, started the charity, which is now massive. So I think there's a link at the bottom of my piece to them. So if people could go and have a look at them, that would be fantastic. I can't
Yeah.
speak highly enough of them. They were brilliant.
What did the Salisbury accommodation have that the place in Bath didn't?
The place in Bath, you didn't have a room. You had what they called a pod, which would be smaller than a prison cell and was always too
Mm.
hot, and a communal area. Um, the the hostel in Salisbury, it's not too much of an exaggeration. It's called a Labouré Place, and they have many places now, but this was the main one. It's not too much of an exaggeration, Mark, to say it's kind of like almost a Premier Inn. I mean, you have an ensuite
Wow.
room, you have a fantastic communal area. Once, if you're not in there on a no second night basis, and once you're booked in properly as a client or a service user, you can come and go as you want, which wasn't true in Bath. They curfewed you in Bath, and if you weren't back by 10 o'clock, you lost your place. Um, and they even they still do. They have a music room, they have a gym, they have a dentist comes around two or three times a month to, ironically, if you've got toothache, you're probably better off being in a laboratory than not because you can actually see a
Wow.
dentist. And all this grew from nothing, um, probably by the grace of God, actually. And I think the quote I've got at the top of the piece is what you see when you go into the Elaborate Hostel. And when I say it's a Christian charity, it's genuinely a Christian charity, Mark, in that they don't care if you're a Christian or not. There's
Yeah, I mean, you in the article you talk about the slight hypocrisy of some Christians that consider themselves to be good people who will step over a homeless person or more or less ignore them as they're begging on the streets.
Yeah, I've seen that happen. I have my issues. I mean, I go to we scheduled this so I could go to church today, didn't we? I mean, I am quite a regular attender. I've actually found God through my experience as a rough sleeper and then being
Wow.
hospitalised. And I did in Salisbury. I saw this happen, not outside the main cathedral, but outside a church near where the Skripals were found, actually near the Maltings.
Mm.
I saw people just literally step over a couple of homeless people on their way out of church. I call them the one, hour a week Christians. They go, well, they go to mass or to a service once a week and they think that's it. What they don't get is that you're supposed to go to church to go out and be the church. That bit of the message these people weren't getting. And also, I was speaking to, I think you know James Benbridge, a friend of mine,
Yeah.
works for Country
Great
Supply,
guy.
about this. He is, yeah, he's a good guy, James. Um, I actually, some of the people in the church were agitating to get where that church is, there's kind of a little courtyard as well, and there were some benches around it. And a couple of people I know, not me, but have been sleeping on those benches. And people at that church were agitating to get those benches removed because, and I overheard one of them say, quote, "We don't want vagrants sleeping on them." That was the attitude.
Yeah. I mean, if that's not contrary to Christ's message, I don't know what
Yeah.
is. Your article is not a ringing endorsement for socialism. Why not?
It's not a ringing endorsement for big state socialism.
Mm.
Because what I concluded was that the mechanisms of the state are too big and clunky to actually fit the particularities of certain very tragic situations, including homelessness. So no matter how well meaning the state is, it's a machine and it moves slowly and it's not sensitive to the needs of people on the ground. So I think that the charity sector is better placed to actually ameliorate this problem because it's never going to completely go away, I don't think. And I think that big state and rapacious taxation probably isn't consistent with the charitable impulse. I think it tends to rob people of the personal, intuition that they should be doing something. That sounds preachy, and I don't mean it to, but that was just something I noticed that
Well,
even
I think
local
you're
government
right.
isn't particularly brilliant at these things. That's just an
No, I think you're
empirical
right about
observation.
the,
Sorry,
the
Mark.
charitable sector are on the ground, aren't they? They've got the expertise. They know what's going on. And
Yeah.
and we've seen it in America that the big state response in places like California has backfired badly, hasn't it? Because there are billions going towards homeless projects in California,
Mm.
San Francisco, LA, and elsewhere. And all you've got is vast tent cities and thousands of people openly taking drugs in the streets. It's not
Yes.
really a solution, is it?
No. No, it isn't. And I think, as I said to you before we started recording, I don't know what the solution is to this. I think I, I'm not making any comparison here with the awful revelations about what's been going on with child rape gangs.
Mm,
But I think let's just veer off homelessness and then come back to it. If I can just make this point, I
of
think
course.
what that awful, like I say, set of revelations has shown us is that you cannot, in certain circumstances, expect the state to interrogate itself and to reform itself. Then there are some
Mm,
situations that are so dire that they're almost apocalyptic in their consequence. And I think there's a brilliant article in the Critic magazine on this. This is a civilizational thing that's coming to light, that all world pieties are being destroyed. Um, so, the whole idea that the state is always a good thing, I think should be interrogated pretty harshly.
mm.
Now, homelessness is itself a tragedy. I'm not comparing it positively to that situation, which is just awful and, almost indescribably awful, almost beyond the imagination. But my experience of being homeless taught me a similar thing, which is that the state just isn't fit to do some things, and it's not always benign in intention. And even when it is benign in intention, sometimes the effects are pretty bad.
Now,
But
the former Home Secretary Suella Braverman said around a year ago that for some, sleeping rough is a lifestyle choice.
mm,
What's your reaction to that?
In my case, you could argue it was, as a consequence of my behaviour. So, okay. In Wiltshire, certainly there are people who choose to sleep rough because they're ex-military and they do service, and then the system doesn't really want anything to do with them. And also, these are people who can sleep rough. So in their case, I suppose it's a lifestyle choice. I suspect that's not quite what she meant, and that she was saying something more along the lines of if you're out on the streets at some point, that's because of choices you've made. I can tell you that's not always the case. There's not far from where I am, and it's part of the Labouré setup. There's a house which looks after basically kids 18 to 24, possibly even slightly younger than that, who basically can't stay with their families. There's been bad breakups within the family, and it's just not safe for them to be there. Social services see this as another option, which I think is reasonable enough, and Labouré looks after them there. It's not their fault that they're in that situation. So it's you can generalize if you want, but once you generalize, you lose sight of the fact that every single homeless person is a child of God. All of them have their own very complex stories of how they got there. Some are more blameworthy than others. If you want to play the blame game, then fine. Um, Certainly applies to me. I make no bones about that. It was my fault where I was and where I put my son, which was even worse.
I don't know how one could sleep rough without drink and drugs. Is that a fair point?
I think that's a fair point, and I'm really glad you brought it up. I know a lot of very well-meaning people who will say that if they walk past a beggar, they're happy to buy them a sandwich, but they won't give them money in case they spend it on drink or drugs. Well, I mean, my reply to that is normally, how do you know they don't need drink or drugs? Um, some of them just do. Some of them need it in the moment. So if you're offering them money as a short-term solution, then why take their autonomy away from them yet further, and not by not allowing them to use the money for what they need in the moment, which may be alcohol and drugs. Yes, you're quite right. It's an astute point you make.
What about in your article, you wrote about how you were at one particular hostel, a certain accommodation. I don't know the circumstances, but you were moved on to make way for
Mm.
Eastern European migrants.
Yeah, that was the Bath hostel, and I wasn't the only one. To get a hostel place, normally, there's local authority involvement. You have to show some kind of, because even if they're charities, they do rely on local government funding. Um, and so therefore, in order to get a place, even at somewhere like a Labouré, it certainly used to be the case. And even though I still volunteer with a Labouré, I'm not one of the admin people. So this might have changed, but I don't think it has. It certainly used to be the case that you had to demonstrate a local connection to the area. So either you're from there, or your child was born there, or you've been living there a certain amount of time, or something like that, or some family members are there. It can be quite nebulous. What happened that Christmas was it was very, very cold, and a cold weather warning was issued, and the cold weather protocol kicked in, which meant that requirement for local attachment was suspended. That protocol was lifted for a while. And the way that was interpreted by this hostel was as saying, well, they could take in some Eastern Europeans and boot some of us out. Now, I obviously I don't think I'm doing them a disservice in that analysis of what happened. I mean, they may have another point of view, but that's certainly how it seemed to us. And like I say, we weren't the only people. I wasn't the only person to be booted out as a result of that.
I mean, do you think, is there a problem there, a sort of conflict of interest? You've got sort of ex-military personnel who have fought for this country sleeping rough. Meanwhile, people that have entered the country illegally, and at the moment it's around 50,000 people a year coming across the channel, accommodated in hotels with warm, comfortable accommodation. I mean, I'm not dismissing that because they're human beings too, but is the perceived prioritizing of illegal migrants over Brits in need, is that a problem, and is it worth having that conversation?
it's worth having that conversation. It's not going to be a problem which is necessarily present to the mind of someone who's rough sleeping at the moment. It's kind of at a couple of levels of separation away from their predicament, isn't it? But I think the problem with that is it seems to be, and I know this is something that Rupert Lowe's been chasing up. It seems to be so difficult to get information from the government about precisely what the numbers are here and exactly what's going on.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, I mean, prima facie, it certainly seems against natural justice to prioritise one set of people who have no national attachment, let alone local attachment. So sure, I agree.
What about this idea that homelessness doesn't necessarily mean a lack of homes? I had an ex-girlfriend in the 90s whose stepfather was the leader of Newcastle City Council,
Mm.
which had homelessness, but also had a surplus of available housing. Can you explain that?
No, um, no, that's kind of outside my area of expertise, to be honest, Mark.
But is it true that you can't necessarily say that homelessness and a lack of homes are directly correlated? Is that right? It's
No,
more
I think that's
complex than that,
probably
isn't it?
I think that's probably fair enough. Yeah, because I think with homelessness you have a complex of problems, and it's not just home
Mm.
shortage that drives it. That's why I always prefer the local responses over the kind of national one because
Well,
that's
because some rough sleepers don't respond well to formal accommodation, do they? So it's really hard to make it work for some people. Is
yeah,
that fair to say?
I think that is fair to say. Yeah,
Mm.
a lot
And
of
why
rough
is
sleeping.
that? Why do some people struggle that accommodation has been sorted out, but within days they're back on the streets again?
Yeah, that's frustrating. It could be that, well, not it could be. But the thing about rough sleeping, and this is something that I have mentioned or referenced in the piece, is that it's a kind of form of life. It has its own kind of etiquette. It even has its own language and grammar. I mean, I can
Mm.
always tell if someone's faking it if they claim to be homeless and they're asking for money. I don't always care that they are, but I can always tell if they are because I always make a point of speaking to people who are out. Um, So sometimes there's a kind of resistance, sometimes even a resentment to be rehoused amongst some people. I have noticed that. In the Elaborate system, what they do is they have what they call move-on flats. So you're not necessarily moving from the hostel system into a new place. They have a facility whereby you can still come under the Elaborate care plan, if you like, for want of a better expression,
Mm.
but you move from an ensuite room into a flat. I mean, that's how well resourced the library is. And then you kind of gradually come to find your own place. That's what happened with me, partly because I was slightly older when I went in there than a lot of people were, and because I was getting sober, and because I was desperate to get well for my son's sake. I kind of enjoyed being there and I wasn't a problem. And it was fairly obvious to them within a couple of months that I was ready to move on. So they put me into the move on flat. So what I'm saying is I moved back into proper accommodation incrementally. So maybe that was helpful in my case. Some people they're not quite ready to go from the street into formal accommodation, I would imagine. In fact, I know that to be the case. Um, it's just a very complex and horrible thing, Mark. And like I said,
Have
I
you
don't have the
have you
solutions.
Yeah,
It,
Sean, have you made peace with that period of your life? And are you on good terms with your son and your family now?
Well, my son lives with me now.
Brilliant.
He's just down the corridor, um, doing something on his uh, gaming PC. Yes. Right, you've gone. Shall I? Sorry, Mark.
If you
Yes.
carry on, what's happened is I need to power up my computer because I'm still getting used to this setup. Brilliant, Sean. You can carry on. So
Yeah.
you're on good terms with and have made peace with that. Sorry, let's just pick that up. Have you made peace with that time in your life?
I am extremely grateful for that time of my life. So I've made peace with it in that sense, but it was also horrible and I wouldn't want to go through it again. So
Mm.
it's one of those paradoxes. In terms of family, yes. Um, you know, people often ask the question, if rough sleepers have families, why can't the family help them? In my case, it was because my mother in particular is still with us, but she's getting on, and there was a form of self-protection there. That there came a point where my behaviour was just such that she had to look after herself, and the wider family felt the same. But yes, those relationships have been properly, if you like, invigorated by what I went through, and I was fairly resentful at the time that my son was with them. Certainly towards my stepsister, who did an awful lot of work for my son, and Ben stayed with her quite a lot, and I didn't like that. So it took a while, but yeah, those relationships are probably better than they were certainly better than they were when I was drinking, and probably better than they have been. Yeah, my regret is that my father died in February
Oh,
2016, and he didn't, live to see me get well. Because I know he didn't die because of this, but I was breaking his heart. It was breaking his heart that his eldest son, who was reasonably accomplished and reasonably bright and reasonably had potential and decent jobs, had ended up in this situation. He just didn't understand it. But I make my
well, Sean, I want to
reparations
congratulate you.
through prayer. Sorry, Mark, I interrupted. Go on.
Well, I want to congratulate you. I want to congratulate you on your incredible recovery and your spiritual journey and the fact that you've rebuilt your life. You look terrific. You're now closer, based on what you said, you're closer to your son and your family than maybe you ever have been. And so, what about the future for you?
I'll just carry on writing. See what the next day brings. I'm blessed in my life. I'm grateful, like I say, for everything that happened. And the, the three things I learned, I think, probably gratitude, the importance of quiet, because quiet time was something I never got on the streets. I was always one of these people, Mark, who needed, even when I was writing or working, I needed a radio on or something like that. But having been on the streets and also recently last year in hospital for 8 weeks, I kind of appreciate quiet now more than I did. So that's good. And also that even in the most low down, bottom case circumstances of life, there's room for creativity, And some of the most creative and brilliant people I met have been on the streets and in hostels. And I've worked at universities and I've known some very clever people, but you know, that person you see on the street begging, there's a story there. And if the piece does anything, I hope it's just to get people interested in this. I don't want to tell people whether they should give money to charities or not. That's down to them. But just get interested. Look up what's going on in your local town about what's being done for the homeless, and it is actually quite an interesting subject to see what's going on. So,
Briefly,
and
Sean,
in my case, Mark, I'll just say one more thing in my case, and that is I got lucky. A certain set of things happened at the same time. I found the Elaborate Hostel. I found
mm,
Alcoholics Anonymous. I found, my faith was developing gradually at that point. A lot of people don't get lucky. I was blessed, and I'm grateful for you to say congratulations, but I probably don't really deserve it. But thanks anyway.
well, I mean, I personally would suggest you have because you've been handed a difficult set of cards in your life. Alcoholism is definitely an illness that was beyond your control, and you've come through that. And I think your son and your family can be very proud of that. And I think you're now a great role model. Before you go, briefly, if you can, Sean, um, homelessness looks to be on the rise. Will we ever tackle it, or is it here to stay? Do you think?
Um, I think it's here to stay. I think there are some people who always will want to live outside the system, as it were. Although I think that's actually impossible. I think to go completely off grid, I think is near impossible. But a lot of
Mm.
people enjoy trying that. I think there's a spiritual crisis in this country, which is has its practical consequences. Homelessness is one of them. There's always going to be addiction. Um, so I think it's here with us. The permanent solution, if there is one, is for people to develop habits of charity and just do little things. Kindness exists in very small transactions, I think. So if you just could do one good thing, buy a homeless hostel a sleeping bag. If you're worried about giving them money, I understand that, but get them a sleeping bag. They always want one of them. But I fear it's just part of the human condition that we're all broken to some extent, and the most broken are going to end up in the worst places, and that's just something that we have to accept and carry on developing remedies as we can. Which is a
Sean,
full
more.
answer, I know, but
Yeah.
unfortunately they are always going to be with us, and therefore they're always going to be potential objects of love. And if you talk to a homeless person, you'll get something from it as well. You're inviting each other into a certain mutual moral space, and that's good for both of you, I
Well,
think.
most definitely, because probably one of the worst aspects of our treatment of homeless people is to make them invisible. I mean,
Sure.
that's what people do when they walk down the street. I've
Yeah.
been guilty of it myself. You look
So have
away,
I.
don't you?
So have I. I'm guilty of it. I do it sometimes. I mean, I try, like I said earlier, I try not to walk past people. I mentioned in the article that a year or so after I was homeless, and me and my son were reconciled in our place also in a small Wiltshire town called Devizes. There was a homeless guy who I'd got to know because I help out at one of the soup kitchens, called Mark, who's sadly no longer with us. But we were coming out from a friend's, I think, and my son had been given some money for Christmas, and we saw Mark, and Ben didn't know who he was. But he said, "Can I go and give that homeless man some of this money, Daddy? Because he's homeless like you were, and he probably deserves it. Like he deserves some help, like you did." And of course, I'm starting to cry at this point. But I found myself saying to him stupidly, "No, keep the money for yourself." And then I thought, "Sean, what are you doing? Of course, he should go and do that because it's going to be good for him." So he did that, and about a week or so later, this guy Mark was beckoning at us across the street, and he said he wanted to have a word with Ben, and he gave Ben the money back plus more. Which is a beautiful thing, and those interactions are precious. So that's kind of a nice way to end it, I guess, is it? But I'm guilty of that as well, Mark. Even someone like me who should know better. It's easy to not exercise the amount of imagination required to think yourself into their predicament, even if you've been there yourself. I
Well,
don't
more
remonstrate
power
with
to
people
you.
here.
Yeah, Sean, more power to you for humanizing people who are sleeping rough and drawing attention to their plight. The article is absolutely incredible. It's inspirational, it's moving, it's devastating, it's really
Thank you.
well written, and it can be found at conservativewoman.co.uk. That's right, www.conservativewoman.co.uk. And it's by the academic, broadcaster, and journalist Sean Walsh. Sean, thank you for your time. I do hope you will
Pleasure.
return to the show in the near future.
Love to. Thank you so much for the platform, and it's fantastic to. Good luck with the new project, and good luck with
Thank you.
your ongoing critique of our wonderful Chancellor of the Exchequer. I've been enjoying that.
Yeah, that's it's something of a saga, isn't it? Listen, Sean, thanks for the good wishes. We'll catch up soon. There you go. Walsh, conservativewoman.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Now, to see the whole show, ad-free and uncensored, plus bonus material, head to my Substack at markdolan.com.